It was one of those heavy, suffocating November nights in the Pacific Northwest, where the mist clings to the windshield and the towering pines of Blackwood Ridge, Oregon, seem to lean in closer to the road. The whole town felt suspended in that thick, grey silence, waiting for the winter rains that never seemed to end. But up at the old lookout point, the gloom didn't matter. It was the night of the annual harvest bonfire, and for a few hours, the flickering orange light held the darkness at bay. The air smelled of wet pine needles and wood smoke. You could hear the bass of the music thumping against the trees, and near the edge of the firelight, 4 seniors stood laughing, savoring the kind of freedom you only feel when you're 17 and the world hasn't broken you yet. Caleb Reed, the captain of the swim team with a messy mop of blonde hair and a grin that could talk his way out of anything, spun his keys around his finger. Beside him was Mason Hall, his linebacker best friend, who was already complaining about the cold. Sophie Vance, the debate team star who had a scholarship waiting for her in Seattle, was teasing Mason about his jacket, while Eleanor Foster, the quiet photographer of the group, was trying to capture the sparks rising into the fog with her camera. They were inseparable, the kind of group that had grown up trading lunchboxes and secrets. That night, they were just 4 kids high on the energy of a Friday night, oblivious to the fact that they were standing on the edge of a mystery that would haunt Blackwood Ridge for the next 13 years. Around 10:15 p.m., Caleb's red 1991 Ford Bronco roared to life, its headlights cutting 2 bright cones into the mist. They were the last ones to leave the lookout. They had planned to take the main highway back into town, a safe, winding 20-minute drive past the lumber mill. But somewhere between the adrenaline of the night and the promise of a warm bed, Mason suggested the shortcut. Locals knew it as Shadow Pass, an unpaved gravel logging road that sliced through the densest part of the forest, shaving off 15 minutes if you didn't mind the potholes. Everyone knew the stories about Shadow Pass, the blind corners, the drop-offs that disappeared into the canopy below, the way radio signals died as soon as you crossed the ridge. It wasn't haunted, but it was unforgiving. Yet, for 4 teenagers who knew every curve of those woods, it didn't feel dangerous. It just felt like the way home. The last confirmed sighting of the group was at the 24-hour Pinecone Diner on Route 9, just before the turnoff to the logging road. The waitress, a woman named Martha, who had served them milkshakes since they were freshmen, remembered them coming in around 10:30. She said they bought sodas, a bag of pretzels, and a pack of gum. They were loud, happy, vibrating with energy. Caleb even asked her if the old gate on Shadow Pass was still open. Martha told him it was, but warned him to watch out for the washout near the creek. Caleb just winked and said they'd be careful. They walked out the door, the bell chiming behind them, and climbed into the Bronco. That chime was the last sound anyone in the civilized world would hear from them. By 1:00 a.m., the Reed household was quiet, but Caleb's bed was empty. His parents assumed he'd crashed at Mason's, a common occurrence on weekends. When Mason's parents called the Reeds at 7:00 a.m., asking if Mason was there, a cold knot of dread began to form in 4 separate households. Sophie's mother drove the main highway twice, scanning the ditches for a flash of red paint. Eleanor's father, a retired foreman, called the sheriff before breakfast. None of the kids had shown up for their Saturday shifts or sports practice. Their pages went unanswered. The silence on the other end of the line wasn't just quiet. It was heavy. Before we dive deeper into the darkness of these woods and the investigation that followed, I want to ask you a favor. Stories like this take weeks of research, digging through archives and piecing together forgotten lives to ensure they aren't just statistics. If you believe these victims deserve to have their stories told, please hit that subscribe button and like this video. It helps us keep the lights on so we can keep shining them into the dark. Your support truly matters. By noon that Saturday, the Blackwood Ridge Sheriff's Department had declared the teenagers missing. A command post was set up at the high school gymnasium. The air, usually filled with the squeak of sneakers, was now thick with static from police radios and the murmurs of terrified parents. Deputies pinned a large topographical map to the wall, drawing a red circle around a 30-mile radius of dense, treacherous forest. The terrain was a nightmare for search and rescue, ravines hidden by fern growth, old mine shafts from the gold rush era, and logging trails that crisscrossed like a maze without an exit. Locals didn't wait for orders. They grabbed their hunting gear and headed into the brush, calling out names that were swallowed instantly by the vastness of the Oregon timberland. For days, they found nothing. No tire tracks on the gravel of Shadow Pass, which had been washed smooth by a morning drizzle. No debris, no sign of a red bronco. Helicopters with thermal imaging swept the canopy, but the trees were too thick, knitting together to hide whatever lay beneath. Then came the false hope. A hiker reported seeing a red SUV parked near the old fire watchtower. Deputies raced up the mountain, sirens wailing, only to find a tourist's rental car. Another tip placed the kids at a gas station 2 towns over, but security footage showed it was a different group of teens. Every lead spiked the parents' heart rates, only to crush them hours later. By Sunday night, a candlelight vigil was held in the town square. The wind kept blowing the candles out, but the families relit them, shielding the flames with trembling hands. Sheriff Tom Miller stood before the cameras, promising he wouldn't rest until he brought their children home. But as he looked out at the black expanse of the ridgeline, he felt a sinking realization. This wasn't a runaway case. 4 responsible kids in a reliable truck didn't just evaporate. The woods of Blackwood Ridge were known for keeping secrets, but usually they left a trace. A skid mark, a broken branch, something. This time, it was as if the earth had simply opened up on Shadow Pass, swallowed the red bronco whole, and sealed itself back up, leaving nothing but the mist and the silence. By dawn the following morning, the quiet town of Blackwood Ridge had transformed into the epicenter of a desperate, chaotic search operation. Sheriff Tom Miller, a man whose face was etched with the lines of 30 years in law enforcement, was already coordinating with state troopers before the sun had fully crested the Cascades. Maps were spread across the hoods of patrol cars, dampened by the relentless morning drizzle. They divided the wilderness into grids: the logging trails, the riverbanks, and the dense, unforgiving interior of the forest. From the sky, 2 National Guard helicopters thundered over the canopy, their rotors chopping through the mist as they scanned for a glint of red metal against the endless sea of dark green pines. On the ground, the search was a grueling slog. Volunteers arrived in droves: loggers, hunters, and off-duty firemen, men and women who knew how to navigate the treacherous terrain. They moved in lines, shoulder to shoulder, trudging through waist-high ferns and mud that sucked at their boots. They shouted the names: Caleb, Sophie, Mason, Elena, until their voices grew hoarse. But the forest absorbed every sound, returning only the echo of the wind in the treetops. Search dogs were brought in from Portland, but the damp ground and heavy rain washed away any scent trails before they could be followed. By the 3rd day, the operation focused on Dead Man's Curve, a notorious hairpin turn on Shadow Pass that bordered a sheer drop into the ravine below. It was here that deputies found what they thought was the breakthrough. A section of the rusted guardrail was bent outward, hanging precariously over the edge. Below, saplings were snapped in a downward trajectory. The radio crackled with urgent shouts. A specialized rappel team geared up, sliding down the muddy embankment on ropes, while the families waited at the top, clutching each other, terrified of what might be pulled up. But after 4 hours of scouring the canyon floor, the team radioed back a crushing update. The damage to the rail was old, rusted through at the break point, and the snapped trees were from a rock slide months earlier. There was no bronco, no bodies, just another empty ravine. The emotional whiplash was devastating. The families had prepared themselves for the worst, only to be thrown back into the torture of the unknown. If you're finding this case as baffling as the investigators did, take a quick moment to hit that subscribe button and share this video. It helps us continue to bring these forgotten stories into the light, and your support means the world to our team. As the weeks dragged into months, the urgency of the search began to curdle into a heavy, silent grief. The news vans packed up and left for the next big story in Seattle. The helicopters stopped flying. The sheriff was forced to scale back the official search, admitting to the press that without new leads, they were looking for a needle in a haystack the size of a county. But for the families, the search never really ended. Sophie's mother refused to touch her daughter's room. The debate trophies, the stack of college applications, the half-read book on the nightstand. Everything remained frozen in time, a shrine to a life interrupted. Caleb's father spent his weekends hiking the ridge alone, carrying a walking stick and a backpack of flyers, checking remote hunting cabins and overgrown trails that weren't on any official map. He aged 10 years in that first winter, his eyes hollowed out by the lack of answers. By 1995, 2 years after they vanished, the Blackwood Four had ceased to be an active investigation and had become local folklore. They were the cautionary tale parents told their teenagers. Don't take the logging roads at night. Don't go up to Shadow Pass. Rumors filled the void where facts should have been. Some whispered that the kids had run away to California to start a band. Others spoke of darker things, a serial killer passing through on Interstate 5, or a drug deal gone wrong deep in the woods. Every few months a tip would come in, a sighting of a red Bronco in a junkyard in Idaho, a girl looking like Elena working a diner in Nevada. But every lead dissolved upon inspection. Sheriff Miller retired in 2004, but he took the ghost of the case with him. He kept a copy of the case file in his home office, a thick binder that smelled of stale tobacco and old paper. On sleepless nights, he would sit under the lamplight, staring at the map of Shadow Pass, tracing the route with a trembling finger. He knew the woods better than anyone, and he couldn't shake the feeling that he had missed something obvious. He had walked that road 100 times. He had stood on the edge of every ravine. He marked potential crash sites with red ink, obsessing over sinkholes and old mining vents that had been covered by landslides. The forest doesn't just take people, he would tell his wife. Someone has to help it. By the 10th anniversary, the flyers on the community bulletin board were yellowed and peeling, curling at the corners like dead leaves. The faces of Caleb, Mason, Sophie, and Eleanor smiled out from a different era, their hairstyles and clothes marking them as relics of the past. To the new generation of high schoolers, they were just names on a memorial plaque in the gym hallway. The town had learned to live around the hole their absence left, sealing it over with silence. But the forest of Blackwood Ridge held onto its secrets with a grip that seemed unbreakable. It would take another 3 years, and a freak atmospheric river event that washed away decades of soil, to finally loosen that grip and reveal that the answers had been buried right beneath their feet the whole time. It was a Tuesday morning in late April of 2006 when the silence of Blackwood Ridge was finally broken, not by a scream or a siren, but by the grinding metal of a Caterpillar excavator. The winter had been one of the wettest on record, an endless parade of storms that had saturated the soil until the logging roads turned to soup and the creeks burst their banks. Frank Reynolds, a contract surveyor who had spent 40 years mapping the timberlines of Oregon, was out on a remote parcel of land known as the Holloway Tract. It was a forgotten stretch of private property, barely 2 miles east of where the search grid had officially ended 13 years prior. The land had recently been sold to a timber conglomerate, and Frank's job was to clear the drainage ditches that had been choked with debris from the landslides. He was working near a low-lying depression in the earth, a swampy slough that locals called the Kettle, because it collected runoff from 3 different ridges. It was an ugly patch of ground, thick with devil's club and stagnant water that smelled of rot and iron. Frank was using the excavator to widen the drainage channel when the bucket snagged on something deep in the muck. The machine groaned, the hydraulics hissing under the strain. Frank cursed, assuming he'd hooked a buried stump or an old engine block left behind by the logging crews of the 70s. He reversed the arm, repositioned the bucket, and scraped again. This time, the steel teeth shrieked against metal. It wasn't the dull thud of wood. It was the high-pitched tear of aluminum and steel. Frank killed the engine. The sudden silence was deafening. He climbed down from the cab, his boots sinking inches into the slurry, and waded toward the pit. The water was murky, brown and opaque, but where the bucket had scraped the surface, something bright stood out against the gloom. He wiped the mud away with his gloved hand. Beneath the layer of algae and silt, the paint was still vibrant, protected by the anaerobic tomb of the bog. It was red. Ford red. Frank felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold spring air. He knew that color. Everyone in Blackwood Ridge knew that color. He scrambled back to his truck, his hands shaking so badly he dropped his radio twice before he could dial the sheriff's dispatch. By the time the first patrol cars arrived, the sky had darkened again, threatening more rain. The deputies cordoned off the area with yellow tape that looked jarringly bright against the grey woods. They didn't rush. There was a heavy, solemn air to the movements, a collective holding of breath. They knew that rushing could destroy whatever evidence the mud had preserved. Word travelled fast in small towns, faster than the official channels could manage. Before the heavy recovery equipment even arrived, trucks were pulling over on the distant highway, locals standing on their truck beds with binoculars, watching the scene unfold at the kettle. The legend of the Blackwood Four, dormant for a decade, had just woken up. If you're hooked on this unfolding mystery and want to see how deep the secrets of Blackwood Ridge really go, please take a second to subscribe and hit the like button. It helps our channel continue to investigate these cold cases and bring closure where it's needed most. The recovery took 3 agonizing days. Large pumps were brought in to drain the bog, the water level inching down agonizingly slow. As the liquid receded, the silhouette of the vehicle began to emerge like a ghost rising from the grave. It wasn't a heap of scrap metal. It was a fully formed SUV, nose down in the sediment. The roof was dented, likely from the pressure of the earth settling over 13 years, but the body was largely intact. When the mud was sprayed away from the tailgate, the chrome letters verified what everyone already feared. BRONCO. A heavy-duty crane was maneuvered into position on the third afternoon. The cables were attached, and slowly, inch by screaming inch, the red Ford Bronco was lifted from its resting place. It swung gently in the air, dripping sludge, a time capsule from 1993 suspended against the tree line. As it was lowered onto the flatbed truck, the windshield was visible. It was cracked but not shattered, covered in a film of grime. But inside, through the murky glass, investigators could see shapes. The interior was filled with silt, but 4 distinct forms remained belted into their seats. The families had been called to a private waiting area at the fire station, shielded from the press. When the confirmation came, it didn't bring relief. It brought a fresh, crushing wave of finality. For 13 years, they had bargained with fate. Maybe Caleb had amnesia. Maybe Sophie had started a new life. The Bronco ended those bargains. The coroner's team worked with respectful precision to extract the remains. Amidst the tragedy, the personal items found inside were heartbreakingly mundane, perfectly preserving the night they vanished. There was Caleb's varsity jacket, draped over the back of the driver's seat, preserved by the lack of oxygen in the mud. In the back seat, they found Elena's camera bag, the lens cap still on. On the floorboard, half buried in sediment, was a mixtape cassette labeled Road Trip 93 in Sophie's handwriting. But as the forensic team processed the vehicle, the narrative of a simple, tragic accident, a wrong turn into a swamp, began to crack. The lead investigator, a sharp-eyed detective named Sarah Thorne, who had taken over the cold case unit, noticed anomalies immediately. The Bronco hadn't tumbled down a cliff face. The body damage was inconsistent with a high-speed rollover. It looked as if it had been driven into the bog and allowed to sink. Thorne shined her flashlight into the cabin, illuminating the center console. The gear shift wasn't in drive or reverse. It was firmly locked in neutral. Her beam moved to the dashboard. The wiring was corroded, but the position of the headlight switch was unmistakable. It was pulled all the way out to the on position. This meant that when the car went into the water, the lights were blazing, beaming into the murk until the battery died. The strangest detail, however, was the location itself. The kettle was situated at the bottom of a gentle slope on private land, accessible only by a chained service road that had been gated off in the 90s. There were no skid marks on the trees leading down to it, no scarred bark that would indicate a car careening out of control through the forest. The Bronco hadn't crashed there. It had been placed there. And as Thorne looked at the skeletal remains of 4 teenagers who had been missing for a generation, she realized that the mud hadn't just hidden a tragedy, it had hidden a crime scene. The earth had finally given them up, but the story it was telling was far darker than anyone in Blackwood Ridge was prepared to hear. The Bronco was transported to a sterile, climate-controlled forensic garage in Portland, a stark contrast to the muddy grave it had occupied for 13 years. Under the hum of high-powered halogen lights, the vehicle looked less like a car and more like a hollowed-out carcass. The red paint, once vibrant, was dull and oxidated, mapped with veins of dried algae. But the real story wasn't on the surface. It was in the details that Detective Sarah Thorne and the state forensic team were about to painstakingly uncover. The atmosphere in the lab was surgical, stripped of the emotion that was currently tearing the town of Blackwood Ridge apart. Here, there were only measurements, angles, and biological facts. The processing began with the exterior. As technicians power washed the undercarriage, clearing away clods of clay that had hardened like concrete, they made the first discovery that would pivot the entire investigation. Detective Thorne was inspecting the wheels. For days, the assumption had been that the tires had flattened over time, the air seeping out through the bead seals as the rubber degraded. But as Thorne ran her gloved finger along the sidewall of the front driver's side tire, she stopped. There was a slit. It wasn't a jagged tear caused by a sharp rock or a root in the bog. It was a clean, straight incision, about 3 inches long. She checked the rear tire. Same mark, same angle. They removed all 4 wheels and placed them on the examination table. The pattern was undeniable. Each tire had been punctured deliberately with a single-edged blade, likely a hunting knife, plunged deep into the sidewall. The precision was chilling. These weren't the frantic slashes of a crash. They were methodical. Someone had walked around the vehicle, likely while it was stationary, and disabled it to ensure it could never leave that valley. The silence in the lab deepened. The narrative of a tragic accident, a group of kids partying, a wrong turn, a slide into the mud, evaporated in an instant. An accident doesn't slash its own tires. Before we unravel the terrifying implication of what the autopsy revealed next, I need to ask for your help. Bringing these cold cases back to life requires immense resources and support. If you want to see more investigations like this, please hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. It's the best way to support the channel and ensure these stories get the attention they deserve. While the vehicle told one story, the remains of the Blackwood Four were telling another, even darker one. The bodies were transported to the State Medical Examiner's office, where Dr. Aris, a pathologist with a reputation for noticing what others missed, began the grim task of the autopsies. The initial expectation was to find blunt force trauma consistent with a low-speed impact, or perhaps signs of drowning. But as Dr. Aris reconstructed the skeletal structures, the puzzle pieces refused to fit the picture of a car crash. Caleb Reed's skull showed a fracture, but it wasn't on the forehead or the nose, where a driver would typically hit the steering wheel. It was on the parietal bone, the side of the head, suggesting a blow came from outside or from a swung object, not an impact with a dashboard. But the most damning piece of evidence came from Mason Hall. Mason, the linebacker, the strongest of the group, had sustained a fracture to the hyoid bone, a small, U-shaped bone in the neck that is notoriously difficult to break. In forensic science, a broken hyoid is the hallmark of one specific cause of death: manual strangulation. Dr. Aris called Detective Thorne into the morgue and laid out the x-rays. Sarah, he said, his voice flat. Mason didn't die from the crash. And he didn't drown. Someone had their hands around his throat before he ever went into the mud. The timeline shifted violently. The violence hadn't happened in the bog. It had happened somewhere else. The Bronco was just the coffin they were buried in. Armed with this new classification, quadruple homicide, Thorne returned to the case files from 1993 with a ruthless eye. She wasn't looking for a missing person anymore. She was looking for a murderer who knew the terrain. She focused on the location of the Kettle. The land where the Bronco was found had been privately owned at the time of the disappearance. Digging through the county assessor's archives, she found the deed transfer history. In 1993, that parcel of land, including the bog and the old logging road leading to it, belonged to a man named Richard Reed, Caleb's uncle. The connection sent a shockwave through the task force. Richard Reed was a local contractor, a man who had sat in the front row at the memorial service, who had hugged his brother, Caleb's father, while they wept for the missing boy. The file noted that Richard had been interviewed once, 2 days after the disappearance. He claimed he had been in Portland picking up supplies that night. His alibi was never thoroughly vetted because, at the time, he was a grieving family member, not a suspect. But the records showed something else. Richard had sold the property in a rush, just 6 months after the kids vanished, for significantly less than market value. He moved 2 states away to Idaho shortly after. Thorne obtained a warrant for the property, specifically focusing on an overgrown patch of woods about half a mile uphill from the bog. Satellite imagery from the 90s showed a structure there that no longer appeared on modern maps. When the team hiked in, hacking through 13 years of blackberry brambles and alder growth, they found the remains of a collapsed maintenance shed. The roof had caved in, and the wood was rotting, but the foundation was still there. It was a crime scene frozen in time. Inside the debris, amidst rusted paint cans and old tools, technicians found the smoking gun. Buried under a layer of leaf litter and decomposed wood were strips of black rubber, tire trimmings. It appeared someone had tested a knife on a spare piece of tire, or perhaps sliced off a damaged section. But just outside the shed, buried in a shallow pit that looked like a burn pile, metal detectors screamed. They dug up a twisted, melted lump of chrome and plastic. It was a fragment of a vehicle grille. The lab would later match the serial number stamped on the back of the plastic to the manufacturing batch of Caleb's 1991 Ford Bronco. The realization was nauseating. The kids hadn't just driven off the road. They had been at this shed. The Bronco had been here. The violence, the strangled breath, the blunt blow to the head had likely occurred right where the detectives were standing. And the person responsible wasn't a stranger lurking in the woods. It was the man who had given Caleb his first fishing pole. The man who had sat at the Reed family dinner table every Thanksgiving. The Blackwood Four hadn't been lost. They had been betrayed. And as Thorne looked at the rusted evidence in her hand, she knew she had to make the call that would destroy the Reed family all over again. By late August of 2006, the investigation that had started in a muddy bog in Oregon had shifted its focus 500 miles east to the high desert of Coeur d'Alene, Idaho. The summer heat there was dry and brittle, a stark contrast to the damp, suffocating mists of Blackwood Ridge. It was here, in a small, nondescript suburb of beige siding and manicured lawns, that Richard Reed had built a second life. To his neighbors, he was Rick, a quiet, reliable contractor who kept his tools organized, paid his taxes on time, and hosted the occasional barbecue. He had remarried, a woman who knew nothing of the shadow that trailed him and had even raised a stepson, teaching him how to fish and fix cars, just as he had once taught his nephew Caleb. Detectives Sarah Thorne and James Miller, the son of the original sheriff, drove a rental car past Richard's house 3 times before pulling into the driveway. They watched him for a moment through the windshield. He was washing his truck, a mundane Saturday ritual. He looked older than the mugshot in the 1993 file. Heavier, his hair thinning and grey, his shoulders slumped with the invisible weight of 13 years of silence. When the detective stepped out of the car, badges flashing in the harsh sunlight. Richard didn't run. He didn't scream. He simply dropped the sponge into the soapy bucket, wiped his hands on his jeans, and looked at them with a resignation that suggested he had been waiting for this moment every single day since that night in November. The air was thick with the sound of sprinklers and distant lawnmowers, a surreal backdrop for the end of a man's freedom. They brought him in for questioning at the local precinct, a courtesy to the Idaho State Police, but Thorne insisted on conducting the interview herself. The interrogation room was small, smelling of stale coffee and industrial cleaner. The walls painted a calming but institutional blue. Richard sat on the metal chair, his hands clasped tightly on the table, the knuckles white. He declined a lawyer. Thorne placed the case file on the table between them. It was thick, heavy with the weight of 4 lives. She didn't open it immediately. Instead, she let the silence stretch, a tactic designed to let the suspect's own anxiety fill the room. For the first hour, Richard stuck to the script he had written for himself a decade ago. He spoke in a low, steady voice, claiming he had loved Caleb like a son. He repeated the alibi about the supply run to Portland, listing off lumber yards that had long since gone out of business. He feigned confusion about the discovery of the Bronco, shaking his head and muttering about how tragic it was, how dangerous those logging roads were. He played the part of the grieving uncle perfectly, a role he had rehearsed at funerals and family dinners for years. But Thorne was patient. She waited until he had exhausted his narrative, until the lies had settled into the air. Then, she reached into the file and pulled out a single photograph. It wasn't of the bodies. It wasn't a Bronco. It was a high-resolution macro shot of the slashed tire sidewall. She slid it across the metal table. "We know about the tires, Richard," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "And we know about the shed. We found the grill fragment. We found the rubber shavings buried in your burn pit." The effect was immediate. The blood drained from Richard's face, leaving him a sickly, pale grey. The calm, collected contractor vanished, replaced by a man who looked as if the oxygen had been sucked out of the room. He stared at the photo, his mouth opening and closing slightly, no sound coming out. Thorne leaned in, dropping the pretenses. "This wasn't an accident. You didn't just lose your nephew. You took him, and you took Mason, Sophie, and Elena. We know you were there. We know the Bronco didn't crash itself. The only thing we don't know, Richard, is why. Was it an accident at first? Did you snap? Or was it something worse?" Richard's eyes welled up, tears spilling over and tracking through the grime on his cheeks. He began to shake, a violent tremor that rattled the handcuffs against the table. "It wasn't supposed to happen," he choked out. "I just wanted them to leave. I just wanted them to get off the property." Over the next 4 hours, the confession spilled out of him, disjointed and horrific, a stream of consciousness that painted a picture of a night gone terribly, violently wrong. Thorne and Miller listened in stunned silence as Richard reconstructed the events of November 12, 1993. Richard admitted that back in '93, he was in a dark place. His contracting business was failing. He was deep in debt to loan sharks in Portland, and his drinking had spiraled out of control. To make ends meet, he had been using the remote shed on the Holloway tract for an illegal chop shop operation, stripping stolen cars for parts to sell on the black market. He was paranoid, sleepless, and constantly terrified that the police or his creditors would find him out. On that Friday night, he was at the shed, stripping a stolen sedan, drunk on whiskey and on edge. The fog was heavy, isolating him from the world. Around 10:45 p.m., he saw headlights bouncing through the trees, Caleb's Bronco taking the shortcut. In his paranoia, Richard didn't see his nephew. He saw the police, or worse, thieves coming to steal his inventory. He grabbed a heavy iron tire and ran out to the logging road to block the path. When Caleb stopped the truck and rolled down the window, realizing it was his uncle, the situation should have de-escalated. But Richard was belligerent, shouting, smelling of liquor. Caleb, confused and protective of his friends, argued back. He saw the stolen car parts in the open shed door. "What are you doing out here, Uncle Rick?" he had asked. That question sealed their fate. Richard panicked. If Caleb told his father, Richard's brother, a man of strict morals, or the sheriff, Richard's life was over. The argument turned physical. Richard claimed he tried to pull Caleb out of the truck to talk sense into him. Mason, seeing his best friend being manhandled, jumped out of the passenger seat to intervene. Richard swung the tire iron. He claimed he didn't aim, that it was a reflex, but the heavy steel struck Caleb in the temple. Caleb fell instantly, hitting the gravel with a sickening thud, not moving. The screams from the girls in the back seat pierced the night. Mason roared and charged at Richard. In the ensuing scuffle, fueled by adrenaline and the terror of what he had just done to Caleb, Richard dropped the iron and grappled with the linebacker. They fell into the mud. Richard, desperate and stronger than he looked, managed to get a chokehold on the teenager. He squeezed. He held on until Mason stopped thrashing, until the woods went silent again, standing over the two bodies, with Sophie and Elena screaming in terror inside the locked Bronco. Richard made the cold calculation that transformed him from a man who had made a mistake into a monster. He realized there was no going back. He couldn't talk his way out of two dead boys. He smashed the driver's side window, unlocked the doors, and silenced the witnesses. He didn't go into detail about the girls, simply saying, "It was quick. I had to make it quiet." The cover-up was methodical and chillingly precise. He knew he couldn't leave the Bronco there. The tire tracks would lead straight to his illegal shop. He couldn't drive it out to the highway. He might be seen. He looked down the ridge toward the Kettle, the bottomless bog that swallowed everything. He drove the Bronco, with the four bodies piled inside, to the edge of the slope above the swamp. But then, a flash of criminal logic struck him. If the car was ever found, he needed it to look like a crash, but he also needed to ensure it sank quickly and didn't float or roll further down the stream during a flood. He took his hunting knife and slashed all four tires, deflating them to lower the vehicle's profile and make it heavier in the mud. He put the transmission in neutral. He reached in and pulled the headlight switch, turning the high beams on. "I wanted to see where it went," he whispered to the detectives. "I needed to make sure it went all the way under." He released the brake and pushed. He watched as the red Bronco rolled silently down the grassy incline, gathering speed before splashing into the black water of the Kettle. The lights stayed on for a few minutes, two glowing eyes under the surface, illuminating the murky water, before flickering and dying out. Richard stood there in the rain until the darkness returned, then went back to the shed, burned his blood-soaked clothes, and finished stripping the stolen sedan. The confession was transcribed, signed, and recorded. When Detective Thorne walked out of the interrogation room, she felt a wave of nausea. The banality of the motive, stolen car parts and a debt, was almost more insulting than the violence itself. 4 bright, promising lives had been extinguished to hide a petty crime. The trial, held 6 months later in Oregon, was the most painful event in the history of Blackwood Ridge. Richard Reed was extradited back to the town he had betrayed. The courtroom was packed every single day. The family sat in the front row, a united front of grief and rage. The most heartbreaking moment came when Caleb's father took the stand. He didn't scream. He didn't curse. He simply looked at his brother, the man he had grown up with, the man he had comforted at funerals, and asked, "How did you eat at my table? How did you look me in the eye on Christmas?" Richard couldn't look up. He stared at his hands, the same hands that had ended his nephew's life. The evidence was insurmountable. The tire fragments, the grill piece, the autopsy reports, and the confession locked the case tight. The defense tried to argue for manslaughter, citing the alcohol and the accidental nature of the first blow. But the jury wasn't swayed. The tire slashing proved premeditation in the cover-up. The strangulation proved intent to kill. The verdict came back in less than 4 hours. Guilty on 4 counts of aggravated murder. Richard Reed was sentenced to 4 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole. The judge, a woman who had presided over the county for 20 years, looked down at him and said, "You didn't just kill 4 children, Mr. Reed. You killed the spirit of this town. You let an entire community live in fear and sorrow for 13 years while you played the part of the victim. There is no prison dark enough for what you carry inside you. Before we reach the final moments of this tragedy, if this story has moved you, please consider subscribing. It's a small action, but it helps us keep these memories alive and ensures that justice, even when delayed, is never forgotten. The resolution of the Blackwood 4 case brought answers, but it didn't bring peace. Not really. Closure is a word people use when they haven't lost a child. For the parents, knowing what happened was a relief, but knowing who did it was a torment. Caleb's father never spoke his brother's name again. He sold the family home and moved toward the coast, unable to look at the ridges without seeing the betrayal they hid. Sophie's mother finally packed up her daughter's room, donating the clothes to charity, but she kept the debate trophies, placing them on the mantle as a quiet testament to what should have been. The town of Blackwood Ridge slowly began to heal. The flyers came down. The memorial plaque in the high school was updated with a new inscription: "Found, but never forgotten." The logging road at Shadow Pass was eventually closed permanently, the county putting up heavy steel gates to prevent anyone from taking that shortcut again. Nature began to reclaim the road. Ferns grew over the gravel, saplings sprouted in the center of the track. The kettle, the bog that had held the Bronco, was drained and filled in by the timber company, turned into a meadow of wildflowers as a gesture of respect to the families. Today, if you drive through Blackwood Ridge, the forest looks the same as it always did, tall, imposing, and silent. But the locals know the difference. They know that the silence isn't empty, it's a weight. The legend of the teenagers who vanished into thin air has been replaced by the true story of the uncle who buried them. It serves as a grim reminder that sometimes the monsters aren't lurking in the shadows of the unknown. Sometimes they are the ones holding the flashlight, helping you look. The case of the Blackwood 4 stands as a testament to the persistence of truth. It reminds us that the earth keeps a record of everything. Mud may cover the evidence, time may weather the memories, and people may lie to protect themselves. But eventually, the rain comes, the soil shifts, and the things we try to bury in the dark will always, eventually, find their way into the light.